Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 10, which focuses on the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment. Before we can jump into the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, it's important for us to know where these people were coming from, which is why we're starting with the medieval view of the universe. So combining basic philosophies of people like Aristotle and Ptolemy with Christian teachings was the mindset of people during the medieval times. They saw the cosmos or the universe as a ladder. At the very top of the ladder, as you might imagine, they saw God was seated at the top of this ladder. Earth was at its base and hell was just right below that. So to them, the perfect human would ascend to heaven. So the ladder also depicted, the steps of striving to be better. So the better you were, the closer you were to God. Of course, still with humanity so close to the base and, hell being just under the base, it's kind of interesting because it kind of depicts how sometimes it's so much easier to be bad than it is to strive to be good. They also viewed Earth as the center of the universe, and they felt like since the universe was designed by God, that humans were lord of this planet. So those old views led to a new view of nature for a couple of different reasons. First of all, interest in literature during that period uncovered some ancient scientific and mathematic text. Now you may think, math text? Yes, math text, because that their creativity fueled curiosity, and curiosity in math and science from the ancient times is what really kind of led to the scientific revolution. And also, there was this idea that nature was harmonious and understandable. People really had that curiosity. They wanted to know more. They wanted to understand more. Now, again, coming from the medieval times into the scientific revolution, it's important to realize that these people weren't seeking out science because they did not want to believe in God because they were Christian. However, it was kind of the idea that because God created these things, they wanted to know more. They wanted to understand more about them. And also another thing that led to the scientific revolution was the development of the printing press. Because, if you had to, write in calligraphy a textbook, imagine how long that would take. But the printing press made reading something that was for the masses. So no longer just for scholars, ordinary people could learn to read, and that also spread Christianity even more. So let's talk about some people that were important to the scientific revolution, and we'll start with Copernicus. He was a Polish astronomer known as the father of modern astronomy. His main theory was that of heliocentrism, which basically meant that the sun is at the center of the universe. Helio is sun, and centric, of course, means center. So the sun is the center of the universe. Now, he reluctantly published this theory in 1543. He didn't call a lot of attention to it because that wasn't his goal. His goal was not to turn science on its head, because at this point, remember, from the medieval worldview, they viewed Earth as the center of the universe, for the reason that if God created Earth, then people were lords of the earth. So for Copernicus to come out and say, oh, the sun is the center, would almost be an anti-Christian statement during that time. He did not want the church to think that he was creating an uprising, or that he was stating something against Christianity. So very quiet in publishing that theory and maintained, it's just a theory. Then comes Galileo. So Galileo actually proved Copernicus's theory, which was a problem because the church, as Copernicus had worried during his time, actually did get pretty upset about it. So we have Copernicus now using for the first time a telescope to study the heavens, actually discovering these 4 moons that orbited Jupiter. So the moons orbit Jupiter, Jupiter orbits the sun. He proves Copernicus's theory. And that caused quite an uprising from the church and actually got Copernicus's book off the shelves, got it banned. And here we go a little more into that. Copernicus suggested, kind of slightly suggested heliocentrism, but Galileo proved it. He never meant to undermine his faith, though, because you got to remember, he was a Christian just like Copernicus was. But he discovered something. How exciting would that be to discover something? And of course, you're going to want to tell the world. And he did, and it bought him life in prison. So anyway, I'm not sure that if you could ask Galileo today, hey, would you do it again? Maybe he'd say no. Maybe he'd do the Copernicus route and just kind of lay low with his discovery. But the Copernican book was actually banned until 1820. Okay, so we also have Kepler, which we'll read about in this chapter. He sought the geometric harmony of the planets, and he called it music of the spheres. He thought it would give him insight into God's mind. And again, we often think of Christianity or religion in general and science as very separate. But here, these people from the Renaissance into the scientific revolution were very religious. They wanted to understand more because they were so excited about their religion. Kepler thought it would give him insight into God's mind. Kepler is the guy who came up with our laws of planetary motion. So if you've heard of him before, that's probably why. He's the one who determined that motion was in an elliptical shape instead of a perfectly round shape. And he also found that planets don't move at the same speed all the time. They speed up when they're near the sun. And he also drew a mathematical relationship between the time it takes a planet to complete its orbit of the sun and its average distance from the sun. But he couldn't answer why any of that was true, just that it was. That's where Isaac Newton comes in. Okay, so Isaac Newton developed laws of motion, or discovered our laws of motion. There are some terms here that you'll need to take a look at. Inertia basically means that a body at rest stays at rest until something else acts on it, and a body in motion continues in a line at the same velocity unless a force acts on it. We're not going to get too much into the science of that, but Isaac Newton, you need to associate him with that and with the laws of motion. And here's the Isaac Newton I know from my childhood. Let me go back for just a minute, if I can. Okay, I can't. So you saw the Isaac Newton on the last slide, the statue. Here's the Isaac Newton I grew up with. Anyway, cartoon Isaac Newton from Schoolhouse Rock. Okay, something important to remember about Newton, he also was Christian. He actually thought of God as an architect, the grand architect of everything. And he believed that God periodically intervened to restore energy to the cosmic system. So to Isaac Newton's mind, there was no conflict between science and divine miracles. They could peacefully coexist. You have the mechanics of the universe that seem very scientific, and you have God that created it all, and God who could step in from time to time and say, yeah, you're a little off track, let's put you back on track. His mechanical universe and adherence to the experimental method formed the basic premises of the Age of Enlightenment. Okay, so there are a couple of types of reasoning too that you'll need to know about. We have inductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, which is empirical evidence that Francis Bacon is known for. He basically means that inductive reasoning observes nature carefully, collects data, draws conclusions, and then tests those conclusions by experiments. If you've ever had a high school science class, you've probably done just that. Deductive reasoning is a rational kind of reasoning, and it uses math and theoretical physics to base conclusions. So maybe you start with a clear principle, and then you use logic to deduce other truths from it. So, maybe you might say for deductive reasoning that we know that when we turn the water faucet on, that water comes out. So, if you turn the cold water on, water comes out. So you could deduce then, if you turn the left knob on, the hot water knob, that hot water would also come out. Anyway, a basic example, but that's an example of deductive reasoning. So that brings us to the consequences of the scientific revolution. First of all, it fostered a rational and critical spirit in intellectual circles. And it also got rid of a lot of superstition, because everything in their minds could be studied, and therefore everything can be explained. You didn't have to kind of make up a story anymore to explain, why there was day and night, or why there was rain, or that sort of thing. And the scientific revolution was embraced by religion. Can't stress that enough, especially because today we seem to impose or imply, or maybe science imposes it, I don't know, but a separation between spirituality and science. But here, during this time, the scientific revolution was actually embraced by religion. They saw it as though God created the natural laws, and ultimately it weakened traditional Christianity because it eliminated the idea of miracles. Now, we talked about how Isaac Newton believed that miracles still had their place inside science, but ultimately, as more people began to understand how things worked, they believed less and less in the idea of miracles. And it also gave people confidence in the power of their own minds, which is an incredible step for humanity. And that led to the Age of Enlightenment. And so that brings us to the Age of Enlightenment, where philosophers or thinkers considered new philosophies. They worked toward a more rational, humane society, and they applied the scientific method to the human world to study people and society. So the philosophers believed that science was on the side of good, but that theology and priests were wicked. And that's because science was exploratory. It gave people a chance to experiment, try things for themselves, to use their deductive or inductive reasoning, and to see why things worked the way they did. But they felt that priests or theologists shared what they wanted people to believe. They thought it was bad that churches used scare tactics to confuse people and to control them. And it broke with the Christian past, although they kept the morals. So that brings us to political thought. The philosophers were against despotism, which is absolute power, which was often very cruel and oppressive. They promoted secularism and separation of church and state. They favored constitutional government with checks and balances. Does that sound familiar? They did not favor democracy, however. They had little faith in most people. That could, if you know your American history, sound a little familiar as well. And most philosophers favored reforming despots who accepted enlightened ideas like Frederick II of Prussia. And you also have Hobbes and Locke, who were philosophers during this time frame. And I put them side by side so you could see just how very different they were. Hobbes, people are selfish. Locke, people are reasonable. Hobbes, the government should protect the natural rights. Locke, government should control chaos and selfish behavior. Hobbes, ideal government equals democracy. Locke, ideal government equals absolute monarchy, but not by divine right. You know, divine right would mean that God appointed you, and sometimes that came down through family lines, sometimes through the church. So Locke was against divine right. Hobbes, rights equal life, liberty, and property. Locke, rights equal give to the government. So two very different views there. Okay, and I've listed a few additional philosophers here that you can read at your own pace. One that I want to point out is Rousseau, who wanted a genuine democracy of people that were devoted to their community. He suggested education reforms to teach children to be productive, responsible citizens and to think for themselves. And he also wanted to keep the innocence of childhood and to teach them through fun experiences, allowing them to explore through their curiosity and imaginations. And we still have, you know, education theories based on Rousseau's beliefs today. So the humanitarian view, let's take a look at that. Humanitarianism is the promotion of human welfare, and welfare as in well-being. They wanted to eliminate torture, which created prison reforms. War was seen as barbaric in the humanitarian view and not very reasonable at all, because, you know, you create war to, you know, find peace. You know, you know, they saw it as barbaric. And many condemned slavery at this point. So let's talk a little bit about slavery in the 1700s. This is Ben Franklin, and he eventually condemned slavery, even though he had slaves himself. He freed them by about 1770. The common thought during this time frame, during the Enlightenment, was that slaves couldn't learn, so they just simply weren't educated. In 1763, Franklin wrote that slaves didn't learn because of lack of education and lack of, you know, opportunities to learn, and because of negative environments, not because they were inferior at all. In 1787, he wrote to ask for donations to help freed slaves to adjust to life through education and suitable employment. Because, you know, think about it. We have people who were stripped from their home, sold into slavery, taken to another country where they had absolutely no opportunity, and then suddenly they're free. You know, free to do what? You know, you have adults who aren't educated, they can't work, they don't have any experience other than what they had, you know, through their slave masters. So it's a very difficult time. Franklin saw that and looked for ways to help. Then in 1790, he petitioned Congress to actually end slavery, but it was immediately rejected. So here are a few more slavery facts from the 1700s. Thomas Paine helped write the act that would abolish slavery in Pennsylvania in 1780. In 1791, British Parliament denied abolition of slave trade and approved abolishing slave trade in 1807. So this cartoon at the left, I thought it was kind of cute. It's called Fashion Before Ease, or A Good Constitution Sacrificed for Fantastic Form. And so this character here is Britannia clasping the trunk of this large oak tree, while Thomas Paine, right here, is using both hands and tugging at her laces, trying to keep things in form. Let's talk about women in the 1700s. So the philosophes still considered women as inferior, both intellectually and morally. So women were pretty much just dogs. Hate to say it, but anyway. Um, so you see Rousseau's comment here: a female wit is a scourge to her husband, her children, her friends, her servants, to everybody. From the lofty height of her genius, she scorns every womanly duty, and she is always trying to make a man of herself. I'll leave it there. Anyway, despite the feelings of the masses, the philosophers' concentration on humanitarianism concepts of equality were at least the first steps toward the women's movement, where it was finally made possible. So the Vindication of the Rights of Women from 1792, written by Mary Wollstonecraft. Women were to men as slaves were to masters or subjects were to monarchs. She also wrote that it was considered tyranny for women not to have equal rights by her and other women. And she argued that, like slaves, women only lacked education. They weren't inferior. They just had not been given the same opportunity. So there again, you have this beginning of an equal rights movement. All right, let's talk a little about laissez-faire economics. Without government interference is what laissez-faire means, and it became a 19th century liberal principle. Adam Smith said, government intervention slows economic progress and reduces the value of land and labor. So when people pursue their own interests, they work harder to earn better conditions, which leads to better economy and better society. So this is the basic principle behind laissez-faire economics. And Adam Smith is known for his work an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Sometimes you'll just see that shortened as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Alrighty, let's go into War and Revolution. In 1740, Prussia, ruled by Frederick the Great, launched a successful war against Austria. Maria Theresa, the Austrian queen, retaliated in 1756 and joined France to fight Prussia in what is called the 7 Years' War. And then during the 7 Years' War, France was fighting England over their claims in the New World, which is called the French and Indian War. Also, continuing on talking about War and Revolution, the British had to pay their war debt, the expense they had of fighting the French in the French and Indian War. So they decided to charge the colonists some more taxes. The colonists didn't like this. It was taxation without representation, and they revolted, which you may know from American history led to the Tea Party, right? The Boston Tea Party, not the political Tea Party. Anyway, which led eventually to the Declaration of Independence that focused on natural rights. The United States of America wins the Revolutionary War in 1783. Washington was deemed a great leader. France helped to get revenge for the 7 Years' War, and Britain had several battles going on. They just couldn't commit to the struggle. So let's talk a little about enlightened despotism. That's ruled by a strong monarch who implements reforms for freedoms and rational philosophies. Some enlightened despots were Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, Charles III, Maria Theresa, and Joseph II of Austria, and then Louis XV in France. And again, remember, these are people who are for freedom and rational ideas, but they are still a monarch because people did not have a lot of faith in the general public as such. So they didn't trust the general public, who was widely uneducated, to make decisions based on their communities. So, critiques of the philosophes include that they overvalued intellect at the expense of emotions or feelings. They didn't call for creative development at this time. They didn't try to understand the past by past standards. They judged based on their modern standards, which is really hard to do. And we do that today. It's very important, and that's why I kept reminding you about the religious nature of early scientific revolution, or because you know we've got to judge the past by past standards, not by our modern standards. They also had the idea of universal truths that could create fanaticism, like Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. Can you imagine seeing someone's head paraded, like a head kebab, right? Going around the village square with his head on a stick. Yeah, that's terrifying. Anyway, they also thought that emphasis on science would eliminate social order. But that did not happen. And that wraps up our review of Chapter 10. You're welcome to go back through the notes anytime. You've got a section that's attached that doesn't have video, so you're welcome to use that as well.